There are moments in history when the entire trajectory of a civilization balances on a knife's edge. Moments when billions of lives hang in the balance, when the very survival of a species teeters between extinction and continuation. For humanity, in the 31st millennium, that moment came when the War Master Horus brought his armada of traitors, heretics, and demons to the gates of the Imperial Palace itself. This is the story of what it was like to be there, not as a space marine or a primarch, but as one of the billions of ordinary humans who called Terra home when the galaxy came to kill them. The siege of Terra was not simply a battle. It was an apocalypse made manifest, a descent into hell that would leave scars on the human psyche lasting 10,000 years. To understand what those who lived through it experienced, we must first understand what they stood to lose and what horrors they would face when the sky itself turned to fire and the ground beneath their feet became a charnel house of unimaginable proportions. Imagine waking up one morning in your hab unit on the 143rd level of Hive Nordafric, the recycled air carrying the familiar tang of too many bodies packed too close together. You go through your morning rituals by rote, splashing your face with the precious ration of water you're allowed per cycle, choking down a protein paste that tastes like industrial lubricant but keeps you alive. You prepare to join the millions streaming toward the manufactorums and administrative centers, ready for another day of grinding labor that defines existence for most of Terra's population. But today is different. Today you notice the voxcasters are silent, their usual propaganda replaced by static and garbled transmissions. Your neighbors are gathering in the corridors, whispering about ships seen in the sky, about the defenses being activated, about orders to report to emergency muster stations. The fear in their eyes mirrors your own, growing dread because deep down you know what this means. The war has come home. This is not some distant conflict fought on worlds whose names you cannot pronounce. This is not a story told by veterans over rot-gut liquor in the lower hab levels. This is real, immediate, and inescapable. The enemy is coming to kill everyone you know, to destroy everything you have ever seen, to reduce your entire world to ash and memory. And there is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, because Terra is humanity's birthplace and final bastion. If it falls, humanity falls with it. Terra in the early 31st millennium was already a world transformed almost beyond recognition from the blue jewel that had once cradled humanity's birth. The unification wars had scarred the planet deeply, boiling away its oceans in nuclear fire, reducing its atmosphere to a toxic haze that choked the lungs of the unprotected. The Emperor had attempted to restore some of its former glory, creating artificial seas and reintroducing wildlife to certain preserved areas, crafting gardens of surpassing beauty within the Imperial Palace itself. But these were islands of tranquility in an ocean of urban sprawl that had consumed nearly every inhabitable surface of the planet. The population of Terra at this time numbered in the billions, possibly approaching 1 trillion souls packed into countless hive cities and arcologies that stretched from the radioactive wastelands to the polar ice caps. These were not the fully developed ecumenopolis that Terra would become in the 41st millennium, but the seeds were already planted. Vast urban conglomerations, housing hundreds of millions each, dotted the landscape, connected by transit systems both above and below ground, their spires reaching toward a sky perpetually shrouded in industrial smog. Life on Terra before the siege was defined by stark contrasts between privilege and deprivation. The nobility and high-ranking members of the administratum lived in relative comfort, their quarters adorned with luxuries brought from across the galaxy as tribute to the throne world. They walked marble halls and ate food cultivated in the few remaining fertile zones, protected from the harsh realities of the world beyond their gilded cages. A single square meter of land on Terra cost more than an entire palace on most hive worlds, and only the wealthiest could afford such extravagance. But for the vast majority of Terra's population, existence was a grinding struggle against poverty and overcrowding. Billions toiled in manufactorums and administrative centers, processing the endless flow of data and materials required to run an empire spanning 1,000,000 worlds. They lived in cramped hab blocks, stacked one atop another, breathing recycled air thick with the stench of too many bodies pressed too close together. They ate synthetic protein and drank water reclaimed from waste, their greatest hope that one of their children might be selected to serve in the Adeptus Terra as a menial, the lowest rank of the priesthood that governed mankind. The hive cities themselves were worlds within worlds, vertical cities that plunged deep into the earth and soared kilometers into the toxic sky. At the top lived the wealthy and powerful, their spires piercing the smog layer to glimpse actual sunlight, a luxury most Terrans would never experience. Below them, layer upon layer of habitation stretched downward, each level more crowded and desperate than the one above. The middle levels housed the workers who kept the machinery of the Imperium running, while the lower reaches descended into lawlessness and darkness, where gangs ruled and mutants lurked in the shadows between flickering lumens. Deep beneath even these levels lay the underhives, vast networks of abandoned structures and forgotten passages, where those who fell through society's cracks eked out brutal existences. Here, the only law was survival, and the strong preyed upon the weak without mercy or consequence. Yet even these depths would seem like paradise compared to what was coming. The Imperial Palace dominated Terra like nothing else, a continent-spanning fortress that had taken over 200 years to construct and was still being modified and improved. Based around the Himalayan mountain range, where the Emperor had conducted his secret works during the Age of Strife, the palace was a monument to human ambition and engineering prowess. Its outer walls soared more than half a mile into the sky in places, 100 feet thick and studded with defensive towers, bristling with enough firepower to level cities. Its processionals were so wide that entire armies could march along them without crowding, and the structure contained over 4 million individual chambers, each serving some vital function in the administration of the galaxy-spanning Imperium. Before Rogel Dawn's modifications, the palace had been a place of surpassing beauty, its architecture blending aesthetics with function in ways that took the breath away. The inner gardens alone were legendary, a pensile paradise of flora and fauna gathered from across the human-settled galaxy, arranged in terraces that resembled a massive amphitheater. The Emperor himself had walked these paths, contemplating the future of his species amidst the carefully cultivated greenery. But all of this was about to change. When word reached Terra of Horus's betrayal at Istvan, when the full scope of his treachery became clear and the War Master's ultimate goal was revealed, a cold dread settled over the throne world like a shroud. The Emperor had already returned to Terra to work on his great project in the dungeons beneath the palace, leaving the conduct of the Great Crusade to his sons. Now, as reports filtered back of the drop site massacre, of 3 loyalist legions crippled and their primarchs dead or missing, the people of Terra began to understand that the war was coming home. Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists and appointed Praetorian of Terra, threw himself into the task of fortifying the throne world with the obsessive focus that defined his legion. He knew better than anyone what was coming, understood the terrible strength that Horus would bring to bear on humanity's birth world. And so, he began to transform the palace from a work of art into the most formidable fortress in human history, regardless of the cost to its beauty. The changes began slowly at first, then accelerated as more news arrived of the traitor's advance across the galaxy. The magnificent Annapurna Gate, renowned for its craftsmanship and artistic merit, was dismantled entirely on Dawn's orders, its ornate decorations stripped away to make room for more practical defenses. The beautiful sculptures that had adorned the Lion's Gate were replaced by grey donjons stippled with weapon emplacements, their elegant curves traded for the brutal efficiency of rockcrete bunkers and macro cannon batteries. Everywhere throughout the palace, beauty gave way to military necessity. Gardens were paved over to create mustering grounds. Artistic friezes were hidden behind blast walls. Graceful archways were reinforced with adamantium and turned into choke points designed to channel attackers into killing zones. The palace's sophisticated void shield network, known as the Aegis, was expanded and reinforced until it could theoretically stop any orbital bombardment. Its generators spread throughout the fortress and linked in redundant networks that would keep functioning even if large sections were destroyed. But Dawn's preparations extended far beyond the palace itself. He fortified Terra's two artificial Mandeville points, the invaluable Dark Age relics that allowed warp translation deep within the Sol system. He constructed rings of orbital defenses around the planet, filling the space between Terra and Luna with weapons platforms and sensor arrays. He recalled loyal forces from across the galaxy, though he knew many would never arrive in time. He requisitioned materials and supplies on a scale that strained even Terra's vast industrial capacity, stockpiling ammunition and provisions for a siege that might last months or even years. For the civilian population, these preparations brought the reality of coming war into sharp focus. Suddenly, their lives were disrupted by construction crews requisitioning entire hab blocks to create fortified positions. Food rationing began as supplies were diverted to military use. Young men and women were conscripted into the Imperial army in numbers that hadn't been seen since the Unification Wars, given basic training and issued lasguns to defend their homeworld from the coming storm. The psychological impact of these changes was profound. Many Terrans had lived their entire lives never seeing a space marine except in propaganda images or distant parades. The legiones Astartes were myth made manifest, demigods who fought the emperors, wars on distant worlds, not figures who walked the streets of Terra itself. But now, as Dawn recalled the Imperial fists, the Blood Angels, and the White Scars to defend the throne world, the citizens found themselves face to face with these towering warriors in their ornate armor, and the sight filled them with both awe and a growing terror. If the Emperor himself had recalled his angels to defend Terra, if Rogel Dawn was turning the most beautiful structure in the Imperium into a fortress designed to withstand the end of the world, then what was coming must be beyond imagining. The fear spread like a contagion through the population, whispered in the crowded hab blocks and muttered in the endless queues for rations. Some sought solace in prayer, flocking to the temples and shrines that dotted the planet, begging the Emperor for protection. Others descended into despair, turning to drink or narcotics to numb themselves to the approaching apocalypse. Violence erupted with increasing frequency as the strain pushed people past their breaking points, and the Adeptus Arbites found themselves overwhelmed trying to maintain order. The wealthy attempted to flee, using their connections and resources to secure passage off-world on the few ships still making civilian runs out of the Sol system. But Dawn's blockade was thorough, and many found their escape routes cut off as military necessity took precedence over everything else. Those who did manage to leave were the lucky ones, though they would carry the guilt of abandonment for the rest of their lives. Families huddled together in their hab units, holding their children close and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, even as the world transformed around them. Parents told their sons and daughters stories of the Emperor's glory, assuring them that he would protect Terra from any threat. But in the darkness of the night cycles, when the children finally slept, those same parents wept silently, knowing that promises of safety might soon become lies. The construction crews working on Dawn's fortifications labored around the clock, their shifts extending to grueling lengths as the deadline of Horus's arrival drew closer. They erected walls and bunkers, dug tank traps and minefields, installed enough firepower to reduce armies to ash. Many of them knew they were building their own graves, creating the fortress where they would make their last stand. But they worked anyway, because what else could they do? To refuse was to accept defeat before the battle even began, and humanity had not come this far by surrendering without a fight. In the deepest chambers of the palace, the Emperor continued his mysterious work on the Webway project, attempting to secure humanity's future even as its present hung in the balance. Those few who knew of his seclusion and understood its purpose carried the burden of that knowledge like a physical weight. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor, moved through the halls like a ghost, coordinating defenses while bearing the terrible awareness that the master of mankind would not be able to lead his forces until his work was complete. As the weeks turned to months and the months stretched toward a year, the people of Terra lived in a state of suspended dread, waiting for the axe to fall. They went through the motions of daily life, working their shifts and raising their families, but always with one eye turned toward the sky, watching for the first signs of the enemy's arrival. Some prayed for the war to come quickly, to end the terrible waiting. Others prayed it would never come at all, clinging to the desperate hope that Horus might be defeated before reaching Terra, though they knew such hopes were futile. The Astronomicon continued to burn, its light guiding ships across the galaxy, even as the planet beneath it prepared for war. The 10,000 psychers who fed the beacon with their souls each day understood that if Terra fell, the light would go out, and humanity would be plunged into an isolation from which it might never recover. They accepted their duty with grim determination, knowing that their sacrifice might buy time for the defenders, might allow one more ship to reach Terra with reinforcements, might make the difference between survival and extinction. And then, after 7 years of grinding civil war that had torn the galaxy asunder, the enemy finally came. The first reports came from the outer system defenses, garbled Vox transmissions speaking of a fleet so vast it beggared description, emerging from the warp like a plague of locusts. Thousands upon thousands of ships, from massive battleships kilometers long to swift raiders and transports carrying untold millions of traitor soldiers. The very fabric of reality seemed to tear as they translated from the Imperium, and those with psychic sensitivity screamed in agony at the wrongness that accompanied the fleet's arrival. On Terra's surface, astronomers and auger arrays tracked the approaching armada with growing horror. The screens filled with contact markers until they became a solid mass, individual ships indistinguishable from the horde. Officers who had fought in the Great Crusade and seen the assembled might of the Imperium at its height reported that this fleet was larger, more powerful, more terrible than anything they had witnessed. Horus had gathered not just his traitor legions, but countless auxiliary forces, ships from the corrupted Mechanicum of Mars, renegade Imperial army units, and things that defied classification. Vessels that seemed to have been grown rather than built, their hulls pulsing with unnatural life. For the people of Terra, the knowledge of the fleet's arrival spread with terrifying speed, despite official attempts to control information. You cannot hide an invasion of such magnitude, cannot suppress the truth when it fills the sky above your head. Those with access to long-range scopes and pict feeds saw the distant flashes of weapons fire as the solar war began in earnest, saw loyalist ships dying in the void as they fought desperately to slow the traitor advance. Each explosion represented hundreds or thousands of souls snuffed out in an instant, crews who had given their lives to buy Terra precious hours. The psychological impact of watching the orbital battle was devastating. Parents tried to shield their children from the knowledge of what was happening, but the children could sense their fear, could hear the whispered prayers and muffled sobs. Families gathered around Vox sets, listening to heavily censored broadcasts that spoke in euphemisms and generalizations, trying to find hope in the announcer's carefully controlled voice. But the truth leaked through in the pauses, the carefully worded phrases that admitted ground had been given without specifying how much, the references to strategic repositioning that everyone knew meant retreat. In the hive, cities, the news triggered panic in some quarters and grim resignation in others. Riots broke out as people fought for passage to the palace, believing that only within its walls could they find safety. The Arbites put down these uprisings with brutal efficiency, but more kept erupting like hydra heads, each one bloodier than the last. In the lower levels, gangs consolidated their power, preparing to defend their territories or exploit the coming chaos, depending on their nature. The truly desperate attempted to flee into the wastelands surrounding the hive cities, thinking they might survive in the irradiated Badlands rather than face what was coming. Most died within days, their bodies adding to the uncounted dead that already littered Terra's poisoned surface. A few hardy souls made it to the deep caves and forgotten bunkers, where they would huddle in darkness and pray the war passed them by. Some of those few would actually survive, emerging weeks or months later to a world forever changed. As Horus's fleet penetrated deeper into the Sol system, destroying or bypassing Dawn's carefully prepared defensive lines, the people of Terra could see the ships with their naked eyes, bright points in the sky that moved with terrible purpose. At night, the orbital battle lit up the heavens like a second sun, flashes of weapons discharge and ship explosions visible even through Terra's perpetual cloud cover. Children pointed at the lights and asked what they were, and their parents struggled to find words that would explain without traumatizing. The elderly, those who remembered the unification wars and the horrors of old night, recognized the signs. They had seen apocalypse before, had survived one ending of the world, and they knew the price that would be paid. Many of them simply stopped working, stopped eating, stopped caring. They had endured enough, had seen too much suffering in their long lives to face this final trial. They lay down in their beds and waited for death to claim them peacefully before the violence could reach them. Religious fervor swept through the population like wildfire. The temples overflowed with worshippers, though the imperial truth officially denied the emperor's divinity. People prayed anyway, desperate for something to believe in, some power that might protect them from the approaching darkness. The Proto-Lectitio Divinitatis, the cult of the emperor's worship that would eventually become the official religion of the Imperium, found fertile ground in this Terra. People who had never given thought to faith before found themselves on their knees, begging a god they weren't supposed to believe in for salvation. The priesthood of Mars worked feverishly to maintain the industrial capacity that kept Terra's defenses supplied, but even they struggled as more reports arrived of the Mechanicum's own civil war. The forges of Mars were divided, with many joining Horus in his betrayal, and the supply lines that had sustained Terra for centuries were being severed one by one. Rationing became more severe, with even basic foodstuffs becoming scarce as agricultural shipments were diverted or destroyed. In the military staging areas around the palace, millions of Imperial army soldiers drilled and prepared, though many had only weeks or even days of training. They came from every corner of Terra, from the hive cities and manufactorum complexes, from the administrative centers and noble houses. Some were volunteers, driven by patriotism or faith to defend their homeworld. Others were conscripts, given a choice between service and summary execution for crimes real or imagined. All of them knew that when the fighting began, their survival would be measured in minutes against foes that had torn apart veteran units across the galaxy. The Space Marines of the defending legions tried to maintain morale, their very presence a reassurance that humanity's finest warriors stood ready to protect Terra. Rogel, Dawn himself, walked among the defenders, his stoic presence steadying nerves and reinforcing discipline. The Blood Angels, led by their Primarch Sanguinius, prepared for the battles to come with the grim determination of warriors who had faced death countless times and emerged victorious. The White Scars, under Jagatai Khan, positioned themselves for the lightning strikes and hit-and-run attacks that were their specialty. But even the Space Marines could not hide their concern entirely. These were warriors who had conquered stars, who had never known defeat in the Emperor's name. Yet now they faced an enemy that matched them in skill and exceeded them in numbers, led by Primarchs who had been their brothers and knew all their tactics and weaknesses. The defenders had the advantage of fortifications and preparation. But Horus had the advantage of momentum and the terrible powers of the warp itself backing his forces. The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard, maintained their vigil over the inner palace with the inhuman dedication that defined them. These golden warriors were the finest fighting force humanity had ever created, each one a match for several Space Marines. But even they knew that their duty might soon require them to give their lives to hold the line for just a few moments longer, and they accepted that fate with the same emotionless determination they brought to all their tasks. As the solar war intensified and reports arrived of the outer defenses being overrun, Rogel Dawn gave the order to dismantle the orbital plates, the ancient space cities that had orbited Terra since before the Age of Strife. Their destruction was necessary, he argued, as they represented potential weak points in Terra's defenses and sources of debris that could be weaponized against the planet. The billions who lived on the plates were evacuated planetside when possible, though many died in the chaos of the transfer, crushed in stampedes, or lost in the confusion. The sight of the plates breaking apart, massive structures that had housed entire generations of families crumbling into streams of molten metal and debris, was a blow to morale that could not be overstated. These had been fixtures of Terra's sky for millennia, visible symbols of human achievement and continuity. Their destruction announced more clearly than any official statement that the end was coming, that nothing would be spared in the defense of the throne world. And then, on the 13th day of Secundus, the bombardment began. The first shells struck at dawn, massive projectiles launched from ships in high orbit that screamed through the atmosphere like meteors. They targeted the Imperial Palace itself, though Dawn's defenses intercepted most before they could reach their target. The palace's void shields, the multi-layered Aegis network that was the most sophisticated defensive system in the Imperium, flared to life with a sound like reality tearing. The shields held, deflecting the impacts with bursts of energy that lit up the sky like artificial suns. But not all of Terra was protected by the Aegis. The outer districts, the hive cities, and the manufactorum complexes had lesser defenses or none at all. And when the bombardment expanded beyond the palace, when Horus's fleet opened fire on Terra itself with the intent to break the defenders' will and slaughter billions, those unprotected areas became killing fields beyond description. Imagine standing in a crowded plaza, surrounded by thousands of your fellow citizens, when a macro cannon shell the size of a building strikes the hive city a kilometer away. The sound arrives first, a roar so loud it ruptures eardrums and shatters windows, followed immediately by a shockwave that throws people to the ground like toys. Those looking toward the impact site are blinded by the flash, their retinas burned by light brighter than the sun. The unlucky ones close enough are simply vaporized, their bodies turn to component atoms in an instant of unimaginable heat. But the truly horrific part is what comes after. The building doesn't just collapse, it disintegrates, billions of tons of rockcrete and plasteel reduced to fragments that spray outward in a deadly cone. Each piece becomes a projectile traveling faster than sound, cutting through flesh and bone with ease. People are torn apart by shrapnel they never see coming, their bodies shredded in milliseconds. Others are crushed as secondary collapses bring down surrounding structures, buried alive in rubble with no hope of rescue. The dust clouds that follow these impacts are toxic and choking, a mixture of pulverized building materials and vaporized human remains that coats everything in a grey-brown shroud. It fills the lungs of survivors, causing them to cough up blood as their respiratory systems try desperately to expel the poison. Many will die days or weeks later from the damage to their lungs, drowning in fluid as their own bodies betray them. And this happened not once, not a dozen times, but thousands upon thousands of times across Terra's surface, as Horus's fleet unleashed an orbital bombardment of staggering scale. The bombardment continued for days without pause, a relentless rain of death that killed billions and reduced vast swathes of Terra to radioactive craters. The population had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide except the deep bunkers and underground facilities that could only shelter a fraction of those who sought safety. In the hive cities, entire levels were simply erased, their populations dead before they even knew they were under attack. The few who survived in the deeper sections found themselves trapped, the access ways blocked by millions of tons of debris, the air recycling systems destroyed, and the water purification plants offline. They died slowly in the darkness, from thirst and suffocation, and the knowledge that no rescue would come because the rescuers were all dead too. The Imperium bombardment lit up Terra's sky with a hellish glow that never dimmed, turning day and night into meaningless concepts. The survivors stopped tracking time by the clock and instead measured it by the intervals between impacts, counting the seconds of relative quiet before the next wave of shells arrived. They huddled in whatever shelter they could find, knowing that survival was a matter of pure chance, that the next shell might strike directly above them and erase them from existence without warning. Parents tried to comfort their screaming children, tried to shield them from the horror with their own bodies, tried to maintain some semblance of parental protection even as the world burned around them. Many made the terrible choice to end their children's suffering themselves, rather than let them die slowly from radiation poisoning or be torn apart by shrapnel. These mercy killings would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, but in the moment, they seemed like the only kindness left in a universe gone mad. The emergency services, already stretched to their breaking point, collapsed entirely under the weight of casualties that numbered in the billions. Medical facilities were overwhelmed within hours, their beds filled with the dying who could not be saved, their supplies exhausted, treating injuries that would have been manageable under normal circumstances, but were now merely delaying the inevitable. Doctors and nurses worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, then got up and worked some more, because what else could they do? To stop was to condemn their patients to death, though death was coming for them all anyway. The dead outnumbered the living within the first standard day of bombardment, their bodies piling up in the streets because there was no one left to collect them and nowhere to put them, even if there had been. The heat from the impacts started fires that spread unchecked through the hives, consuming everything combustible and filling the air with toxic smoke. Those who survived the shells and the shrapnel often died from smoke inhalation, their lungs scorched by superheated air, or from carbon monoxide poisoning as the fires consumed all available oxygen. The bombardment targeted not just population centers, but also infrastructure critical to Terra's survival. Power plants exploded in mushroom clouds that added to the toxic haze choking the planet. Water purification facilities were destroyed, contaminating the supply and ensuring that even those who survived the immediate attacks would face slow death from disease and dehydration. Food storage warehouses were obliterated, their contents vaporized or buried under tons of rubble, dooming millions to starvation. Within the palace walls, the defenders could see the destruction of the world beyond their defenses, could hear the screams of billions dying, and knew they were powerless to stop it. The aegis held firm, protecting those within from the bombardment, but each impact against the shields was a reminder that they were besieged, that the enemy was all around them, and that their survival depended on the shields never failing. Rogel Dawn watched from the walls as Terra burned, his face an impassive mask that hid whatever emotions he felt at seeing the Emperor's homeworld reduced to a hellscape. He gave his orders calmly, adjusting the defenses and repositioning his forces to meet the ground assault he knew was coming. But those who served closest to him reported that in the rare moments when he thought himself unobserved, the Praetorian of Terra's hands would clench into fists so tight that his gauntlets creaked under the strain. The bombardment served multiple purposes beyond simple destruction. It was psychological warfare designed to break the defenders' will, to make them understand that they faced an enemy with the power and willingness to kill everyone on Terra, if that's what victory required. It created chaos that would make organizing resistance difficult when the ground forces landed. And it was a blood offering to the dark gods that Horus now served. Billions of lives snuffed out in violence to weaken the Emperor's psychic shield and allow demons to manifest on Terra's soil. After 12 days of this hellish bombardment, when the death toll had climbed beyond counting, and Terra's surface had been transformed into a nightmarish landscape of craters and ruins, the ground assault began. The traitor fleet launched drop pods and landing craft in numbers that darkened the sky, thousands upon thousands of transports screaming through the poisoned atmosphere to deliver their cargoes of death. Many were destroyed by the palace's anti-aircraft batteries, turned to flaming debris that rained down on the ruins below. But many more made it through, their armored hulls slamming into the ground with impacts that registered on seismographs across the planet. From the drop pods emerged traitor space marines, the Psongul, once loyal legions who had turned their backs on the Emperor and sworn themselves to chaos. The sight of them triggered a primal terror in the defending forces, for these were warriors who should have been protectors transformed into the enemy. The sons of Horus, their armor now a sickly green and decorated with the eye of Horus, advanced with the disciplined precision that had made them legends during the Great Crusade. The World Eaters, blood-mad berserkers who had given themselves over entirely to Khorne's hunger for skulls, charged forward with chain axes revving, caring nothing for tactics or strategy, only for the slaughter to come. The Death Guard emerged from their transports like walking plagues, their armor corroded and leaking filth, their bodies swollen with disease. Where they walked, the very ground rotted beneath their feet, turning to putrid mud that sucked at the boots of the defenders. The stench that accompanied them was beyond description, a mixture of decay and chemical warfare that caused even hardened soldiers to vomit uncontrollably. Their weapons fired shells loaded with vile toxins that turned flesh to slurry and filled the lungs with choking phlegm, drowning victims in their own corrupted fluids. The Emperor's children, once paragons of perfection and artistry, had descended into utter depravity, their armor now adorned with obscene decorations, and their weapons modified to inflict maximum suffering. They did not simply kill, they inflicted torment for its own sake, drawing out deaths for the pleasure it gave them. Their sonic weapons could reduce a man's insides to paste while leaving him conscious and screaming, could shatter bones and rupture organs without breaking the skin. They laughed as they killed, their laughter the most horrible sound anyone had ever heard, a mockery of joy that spoke to utter madness. Alongside the traitor Marines came the corrupted Imperial army units, soldiers who had turned against the Emperor for reasons ranging from genuine belief in Horus's cause to simple cowardice and opportunism. They numbered in the millions, a tide of humanity turned traitor, armed with standard Imperial weapons, but fighting with a fanatical zeal born of either true conviction or the knowledge that capture meant only execution. Among them marched cultists who had never been part of the Imperial military, civilians from conquered worlds who had given themselves to chaos and now fought with improvised weapons and suicidal courage, throwing their lives away to drag down a single defender. But worst of all were the mutants and the demons, the things that should not exist, given form by the warp energies that saturated Horus's forces. Mutants whose bodies had been twisted by exposure to chaos bore little resemblance to humanity, their flesh warped into new and horrible configurations. Some had extra limbs ending in claws or pincers. Others had faces split down the middle, revealing rows of teeth in mouths. That should not exist. They moved with unnatural speed and strength, driven by mad hunger or the commands of their demonic masters. And the demons themselves, once kept at bay by the Emperor's psychic might, now found cracks in his defenses weakened by the blood sacrifice of the bombardment. They manifested as reality-defying horrors, creatures of living nightmare given physical form, bloodletters of Khorne, brass-skinned killers with swords that could cut through tank armor, charged forward in waves that cared nothing for casualties. Plague bearers of Nurgle shambled through the ruins, their diseased touch causing flesh to rot and metal to corrode. Each demon that manifested made it easier for more to follow, their presence creating tears in the fabric of reality that widened with every death. The first traitor forces to land targeted the outer defensive perimeters, the fortified lines that Dawn had constructed beyond the palace walls. Here, the loyalist Imperial army held positions in bunkers and trenches, supported by armor and artillery, waiting for the enemy to come to them. When the traitors emerged from their drop pods and began their advance, the defenders opened fire with everything they had. The sound of modern warfare is beyond anything a civilian can imagine. The constant thunder of artillery, the scream of rockets, the distinctive crack of lasgun fire multiplied by thousands, the roar of plasma weapons, the hiss of melter guns, all blending into a wall of noise that makes communication impossible and drives some men mad from sensory overload alone. Add to this the screams of the wounded and dying, the war cries of charging enemies, the metallic grind of tanks and the whistle of incoming shells, and you have an environment of total chaos that would break most people's minds within minutes. For the civilians caught in the war zones, trapped in the outer hives and settlements beyond the palace's protection, the arrival of the traitor ground forces meant the end of hope. Some tried to flee toward the palace, joining the streams of refugees that clogged every route leading to safety. These refugee columns stretched for kilometers, millions of people carrying whatever possessions they could manage, pushing carts loaded with children and elderly relatives, desperate to reach the walls before the enemy caught them. But the traitors showed no mercy to refugees. The emperor's children, in particular, seemed to delight in catching these fleeing civilians, herding them like cattle and inflicting horrors upon them that defy description. They took prisoners, not for interrogation or hostage purposes, but for their own twisted pleasures, dragging victims back to their camps, where they would be subjected to tortures that combined physical mutilation with psychic violation. The sounds that came from those camps haunted the nightmares of everyone who heard them, screams that conveyed suffering beyond anything a sane mind could comprehend. The truly desperate civilians attempted to arm themselves and fight, forming ad hoc militias with whatever weapons they could scavenge. In some cases, this resistance actually succeeded in delaying the traitors, particularly when facing the less organized cultist forces. A mob of civilians with makeshift weapons and Molotov cocktails could overwhelm a small group of cultists through sheer numbers, though the cost in lives was horrific. But against actual traitor space marines, these civilian fighters stood no chance whatsoever. A single Chaos Marine could slaughter hundreds of unaugmented humans before they could bring him down through weight of fire, and the trauma of watching their friends and family members being literally torn apart by superhuman killers broke most civilian resistance quickly. The refugee streams that made it to the palace walls found themselves in a different kind of hell, pressed into crowds so dense that people suffocated standing upright, crushed against the pearl, rockcrete barriers by the press of bodies behind them. The palace gates had to be carefully controlled to prevent stampedes, but this meant thousands died waiting for entrance that never came, dying of exposure and dehydration within sight of salvation. Those who did make it inside the palace walls found themselves in a different world, one where the Aegis Void Shield still held and the immediate threat of bombardment and ground assault was lessened. But safety is a relative term when you're packed into a fortress that's under siege by the forces of hell itself. The inner palace complex, designed to house thousands, now sheltered millions of refugees alongside the military forces preparing to defend it. Every corridor was packed with huddled masses, every chamber repurposed as emergency shelter, every garden and plaza turned into a refugee camp. The conditions within the palace for these refugees were barely better than the hellscape outside. Food was severely rationed, with refugees receiving starvation-level portions of nutrient paste and recycled water. Medical care was non-existent for any injury that wasn't immediately life-threatening, and even those who needed urgent treatment often had to wait days for attention, as the limited medical staff prioritized military personnel and critical civilian workers. Disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded refugee quarters, with basic sanitation becoming impossible to maintain. Latrines overflowed and living spaces became cesspits as people had nowhere else to relieve themselves. Children died of diseases that should have been easily treatable, their small bodies simply giving up under the combined stresses of malnutrition and infection. Parents were forced to continue living and sleeping next to their children's corpses because there was nowhere else to put them. The collection crews overwhelmed and unable to keep up with the death toll. The psychological toll of living in such conditions, while knowing that outside the walls billions were dying, was crushing. Survivors' guilt plagued those who had made it inside while their friends and family members had not. Arguments and fights broke out constantly over the limited resources, over space to sleep, over scraps of food. The Adeptus Arbites struggled to maintain order, their enforcement methods brutal by necessity, because any breakdown in discipline could lead to chaos that would kill thousands through stampedes and riots alone. Yet amidst all this suffering, there were also moments of profound humanity. Strangers shared their meager rations with those who had nothing. Mothers nursed children who were not their own when the biological parents had been killed. Elderly civilians who had survived the unification wars organized work crews and discipline committees, using their experience to impose structure on chaos. Faith gatherings provided emotional support and a sense of community, giving people something to believe in when all seemed lost. The military forces within the palace maintained their readiness despite being surrounded by this sea of suffering. The Space Marines of the defending legions positioned themselves at key defensive points. Their presence a reassurance to both the refugees and the Imperial Army soldiers who would bear the brunt of the fighting. The Adeptus Custodes continued their vigil over the inner palace and the Emperor's throne room, their golden armor a reminder that humanity's finest warriors still stood ready to give their lives for Terra's defense. The Imperial Fists, masters of siege warfare and defensive operations, had fortified every possible avenue of approach, creating layered defenses that would force attackers to fight for every meter of ground. Their positions were masterworks of military engineering, designed to maximize the defenders' firepower while minimizing their exposure to enemy weapons. Sigismund, the first captain and greatest blade master of his legion, walked among the ramparts with his customary sword at his side, his mere presence steadying the nerves of soldiers who would soon face enemies beyond their worst nightmares. The Blood Angels, known for their nobility and martial prowess, held sections of the outer walls, their red armor a brilliant splash of color against the grey rockcrete. They were warriors who knew they might be called upon to resist their own genetic curse, the red thirst that could turn them into blood-mad berserkers, and their discipline in the face of this internal enemy made them ideal for the grinding defensive warfare to come. Their Primarch Sanguinius, the great angel himself, flew above the walls on his white wings, visible to defenders and attackers alike, his presence a symbol of defiance that lifted the spirits of everyone who saw him. The White Scars prepared for their own style of warfare, planning the lightning raids and hit-and-run attacks that were their specialty. Unlike their brother legions who would hold fixed positions, the Khan's warriors would strike where least expected, targeting enemy command posts and supply lines, keeping the traitors off balance and preventing them from massing their forces for overwhelming assaults. Their bikes and land speeders were maintained in constant readiness, fueled and armed, waiting only for the order to ride out and bring death to the Emperor's enemies. But while the Space Marines would be the tip of the spear, the backbone of the defense was the Imperial Army, the millions of ordinary human soldiers who would hold the line with nothing but their faith, their lasguns, and their courage. These were not the elite solar auxilia who had fought across the galaxy, though some of those veterans were among their number. Most were conscripts and volunteers pulled from Terra's population, men and women who had been civilians weeks or even days before. They manned the walls and bunkers with hands that shook, knowing that when the traitors came, they would face and kill. Enemy that had broken veteran units across the galaxy. The officers tried to maintain morale through rousing speeches and appeals to duty and honor. They reminded the soldiers that they fought for their families, for their children, for the survival of humanity itself. They promised that the Emperor was with them, that their sacrifices would be remembered for all time. But in the quiet moments, in the darkness before the attacks came, the soldiers knew the truth. They were going to die, most of them, and the only question was how long they could hold before being overrun. Food for the defenders was carefully rationed to maintain fighting strength, but even military rations had to be reduced as the siege dragged on and supply lines from other parts of Terra were cut by the traitor advance. Water was recycled and purified endlessly, the same molecules passing through bodies countless times until the taste was so foul that soldiers had to force themselves to drink it despite their gagging reflexes. Sleep was snatched in short intervals between attacks, soldiers collapsing in full armor wherever they could find space, their dreams haunted by the faces of those they'd killed and those they'd failed to save. The Mechanicum forces loyal to the Emperor maintained the vast war machines that were crucial to the defense, the Titans and Knights that could match the traitor forces in raw firepower. These towering engines of war, some standing as tall as buildings, were humanity's answer to the monsters that Horus had brought to Terra. The Legio Ignatum, the Fire Masters, stood ready with their god machines crackling with barely contained power. The crews inside these titans, linked to their machines through neural interfaces, felt the eagerness of the machine spirits to join battle, to prove their worth against the corrupted titans of the traitor Legios. Outside the palace walls, the war ground on, with a brutality that shocked even hardened veterans. The traitors threw wave after wave of forces against the defenses, accepting casualties that would have broken any sane army. They fought not with the disciplined tactics of the Great Crusade, but with a mad fervor born of chaos worship, caring nothing for their own lives, only for the chance to kill and die in service to their dark gods. The Death Guards advanced through the outer districts, turned the very ground into a plague marsh, their presence corrupting everything they touched. Buildings rotted from within, their structural integrity failing as rust and decay ate through support beams. The defenders who faced them found their weapons jamming, their armor corroding, their flesh developing sores that wept foul-smelling pus. Even in death, the Death Guard were dangerous, their bodies releasing clouds of toxic gas that killed anyone who approached to loot or confirm the kills. The World Eaters cared nothing for tactics or strategy, only for the thrill of close combat and the glory of dying in battle. They charged defensive positions that any sane warrior would have avoided, taking horrific casualties from massed lasgun fire and artillery. But those who reached the defenders fell upon them with chain axes and possessed weapons that thirsted for blood. Once the World Eaters got into close combat, no normal human could stand against them. They killed with a speed and fury that defied belief, painting themselves red with the blood of their victims, their laughter and war cries echoing across the battlefield. The Emperor's children had largely stopped participating in the serious military operations, their descent into depravity complete. While the other legions fought to breach the palace defenses, Fulgrim's sons embarked on a rampage against Terra's civilian population that would leave scars lasting 10,000 years. They hunted civilians through the ruins, not to kill them quickly, but to inflict suffering that fed their twisted senses. They captured millions and dragged them back to their camps, where these unfortunates were subjected to horrors that combined the worst aspects of torture, violation, and mad experimentation. The things the Emperor's children did to their captives cannot and should not be described in detail, for there are some knowledge that serve no purpose except to inflict trauma on those who learn of them. Suffice to say that they rendered down human bodies to create drugs and stimulants, that they found pleasure in suffering beyond anything a sane mind could comprehend, that they turned murder into an art form where the canvas was living flesh and the medium was agony. The sounds that came from their camps carried for kilometers, screams that spoke of pain so absolute that death became not just preferable, but desperately desired. The civilians still trapped in the outer districts lived in constant terror of the Emperor's children. They hid in rubble and ruins, moving only at night, scavenging for food and water, while trying to avoid any contact with the enemy. Some formed resistance cells and attempted to fight back, setting ambushes and booby traps that occasionally killed a few traitors. But these victories were Pyrrhic at best, as the Emperor's children responded to any resistance by wiping out entire districts, killing everyone they found regardless of whether they had participated in the attack. The traitor forces began to manifest demons in greater numbers as the blood sacrifice continued, and the Emperor's psychic shield weakened under the sustained assault. These demons were reality-defying horrors, creatures that existed to spread suffering and death. The sight of them could break a person's mind, their forms violating natural laws and geometric principles in ways that caused physical pain to those who looked upon them. Some demons were barely visible, flickering in and out of reality, their presence marked only by the freezing cold that accompanied them and the screams of their victims. Others were massive and obvious, towering monsters that rampaged through the defenses like living siege engines. The defenders had little effective defense against demons, for how do you kill something that isn't truly alive, that can only be banished temporarily before it reforms in the warp and returns? The Grey Knights, the secret chamber of demon hunters that would later be formed from this crisis, did not yet exist. The Adeptus Custodes and the Space Marine librarians could fight demons on more equal terms, their psychic abilities and warp-forged weapons giving them the tools they needed. But they were few, and the demons were many, and for every demon banished, 2 more seemed to take its place. The loyal Titan Legios engaged their traitor counterparts in battles that shook the ground for kilometers around. When god machines fight, the very landscape is reshaped by their fury. Buildings were obliterated by stray shots from weapons meant to kill other titans. Entire city blocks were flattened by the footfalls of engines weighing thousands of tons. The princeps inside these walking cathedrals of war felt every impact, every kill. The machine spirits they were bonded with screaming in triumph or howling in pain as they traded fire with the enemy. The Lion's Gate spaceport became a focal point of the fighting, as both sides recognized its strategic importance. The facility was vital for reinforcements and supply, and Dawn could not allow it to fall without abandoning any hope of relief forces reaching the palace. The traitors, for their part, needed the spaceport to fully deploy their heaviest equipment and establish a secure landing zone. The fighting around the Lion's Gate was some of the most intense of the entire siege, with both sides committing their best troops and accepting horrific casualties to achieve their objectives. Thousands of Imperial Army soldiers died holding the spaceport against overwhelming odds, buying time with their lives for the relief, forces that they hoped were coming, but secretly feared would never arrive. The defenders fought from bunkers and trenches, from the control towers and hangar bays, from behind barricades made of their own dead. They held not because they thought they could win, but because they had nowhere to retreat to and no alternative but death. The White Scars conducted a daring raid to retake the Lion's Gate in a lightning assault that caught the traitors off guard. Jagatai Khan led the attack personally, his bike racing across the battlefield faster than the traitors could track, his power sword cutting down enemies with contemptuous ease. The raid succeeded in reclaiming the spaceport, at least temporarily, but the cost was terrible. Thousands of White Scars died in the assault, and the Khan himself was gravely wounded in a confrontation with the traitor Primarch Mortarion, the Death Guard's lord, who had fully embraced Nurgle's corruption and become a demon prince. The sight of a Primarch, wounded, of the seemingly invincible demigods, bleeding and in pain, was profoundly disturbing to the defending forces. If the Emperor's sons could fall, what chance did mere mortals have? Yet paradoxically, it also inspired them. For if the Primarchs were willing to risk death in defense of Terra, how could lesser warriors do any less? The siege entered a new phase as the traitors pushed closer to the palace walls themselves, establishing siege lines and bringing up their heaviest weapons. The Iron Warriors, masters of siege warfare under their Primarch Perturabo, coordinated the assault with mechanical precision. They built fortifications of their own, creating strongpoints that would be nearly as difficult for the defenders to retake as the palace itself was for the traitors to breach. They positioned artillery and deployed their siege engines, massive war machines designed specifically to break fortifications that had never been broken before. The bombardment of the palace walls began in earnest, with the traitors focusing their fire on specific sections in an attempt to create breaches. The Aegis void shields held against the orbital bombardment, but they were less effective against ground-based fire, particularly when the attackers could concentrate their weapons on small areas. Day and night, the shields were hammered by artillery shells, plasma blasts, and laser beams, each impact draining their power reserves and stressing the generators that maintained them. The defenders watched the void shield's strength indicators drop with growing dread, knowing that when the shields finally fell, the walls would be exposed to direct fire and the palace itself would be vulnerable. The tech priests worked frantically to maintain the generators and rotate damaged sections offline for repair, but they were fighting a losing battle against the sheer volume of incoming fire. Inside the palace, the refugees could hear the constant thunder of bombardment even through meters of rockcrete, feel the tremors as impacts struck the shields. They knew that their survival depended on those shields holding, that if the barriers fell, the traitors would pour into the palace and everyone inside would die. Parents held their children close and whispered reassurances they didn't believe, promising that everything would be fine while listening to the walls shake from impacts that grew closer with each passing hour. The defenders on the walls saw the traitor forces massing for assault, saw the siege towers being wheeled forward and the battering rams being positioned. They checked their weapons one more time, made their peace with whatever gods they believed in, and prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. They knew the mathematics of warfare, understood that each defender they killed might mean one less traitor to murder civilians, one less monster to defile the palace halls. When the assault finally came, it was with a fury that beggared description. Thousands of traitor space marines rushed the walls simultaneously, supported by cultists and mutants and demons in numbers that seemed endless. They came under covering fire from their artillery, through gaps in the defensive fire that their officers had calculated with cold precision, accepting horrific casualties to reach the walls and begin the real fighting. The defenders met them with everything they had. Las cannons fired until their barrels melted, killing a traitor marine with each shot before the weapon became unusable scrap. Heavy bolters chewed through ammunition at rates that would empty their magazines in seconds, the gunners' arms numb from the recoil as they poured fire into the advancing enemies. Flamers turned entire sections of wall into infernos, burning cultists and mutants alive, their screams adding to the cacophony of battle. But still the traitors came on, climbing over their own dead, using the bodies of their fallen as shields and ladders. Where one fell, two more took their place, and where two fell, four more emerged from the smoke and flames. The first traitors to reach the walls died quickly, picked off by concentrated fire before they could establish a foothold. But gradually, through sheer weight of numbers and willingness to accept any cost, some began to make it to the top of the walls and engage the defenders in close combat. A traitor, Space Marine in close combat with normal humans is not a fight, it's a massacre. Each one could kill dozens of soldiers in minutes, their enhanced strength allowing them to literally tear people apart with their bare hands if their weapons jammed or ran dry. The defenders tried to bring them down with concentrated fire, with grenades and melter weapons and anything else that might kill a transhuman warrior. Sometimes they succeeded, but more often they died screaming as the traitors' chain axe found them or their bolter blew them apart. The loyalist Space Marines countercharged wherever. The traitors gained a foothold, meeting Chaos Marine with Loyal Marine in duels that shook the walls with their fury. These fights were between warriors who had once been brothers, who had trained together and fought together and bled together across the stars. They knew each other's fighting styles, knew each other's weaknesses, and they used that knowledge to kill each other with a viciousness born of betrayal and hatred. The Blood Angels fought with barely controlled fury, their genetic curse of the red thirst threatening to overwhelm them with each battle. They walked a knife's edge between controlled violence and berserker rage, using their anger to fuel their fighting while desperately maintaining enough discipline to avoid becoming the monsters they fought against. When they finally gave in to the thirst, they became killing machines that slaughtered friend and foe alike, and their brother Marines were forced to put them down before they could do more damage. The Imperial Fists held their sections with the stubborn determination that defined their legion, refusing to give ground no matter the cost. They fought from prepared positions, using their knowledge of the fortifications they had built to maximum advantage. Every meter of wall had been designed with overlapping fields of fire, with kill zones and murder holes, with pre-positioned ammunition and supply caches. The traitors paid in blood for every centimeter they advanced, but advance they did, pushing the defenders back through sheer attrition. Sigismund, the Emperor's champion, walked the walls like death incarnate, his black sword cutting down traitor after traitor with contemptuous ease. He fought with a precision and economy of motion that was beautiful in its lethality, each strike placed exactly where it needed to be to kill or cripple. Around him, Imperial Fists rallied and held, inspired by his presence and his refusal to yield. But even Sigismund could not be everywhere at once, and there were kilometers of walls to defend. The gates became focal points of desperate fighting, as the traitors recognized that breaking through a gate would be easier than scaling the walls under fire. They brought up battering rams and melter charges, massive explosives that could blow open even the most heavily armored gates. The defenders countered with murder holes that let them pour fire down on anyone approaching the gates, with boiling oil and promethium that turned the area in front of the gates into killing zones. But the traitors were willing to sacrifice thousands to breach a gate, and eventually, through sheer persistence, some succeeded. When a gate fell, the defenders had to fall back to secondary positions, creating choke points where they could bring concentrated fire to bear on the traitors pouring through the breach. The fighting in these choke points was the most intense of the siege, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage, and the casualties mounting to horrific levels. The refugees inside the palace could hear the fighting getting closer, could hear the screams and explosions that marked each traitor advance. They knew that if the walls fell completely, they would be at the mercy of enemies who had no mercy to give. Some prepared to fight with whatever weapons they could improvise, kitchen knives and makeshift clubs and sharpened pieces of metal. Others prepared to die on their own terms, gathering their families close and making plans to ensure their deaths would be quick, rather than lingering at traitor hands. The Adeptus Custodes, watching from the inner palace, prepared to deploy if the outer defenses collapsed entirely. These golden warriors were the Emperor's last line of defense, the ultimate guardians who would fight to the last man to protect their master. But deploying them would mean the situation was desperate beyond measure, that everything else had failed, and only the Emperor's own guard stood between Terra and annihilation. In the depths of the palace, in the chambers where the Emperor sat upon the golden throne, attempting to hold shut the webway gate that Magnus had shattered, the master of mankind could feel the deaths of his children, could sense the desperation of the defenders and the exultation of the traitors. But he could not abandon his vigil, for if he did, the demons pouring through the webway breach would overwhelm the palace from within before the traitors could breach it from without. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest advisor and confidant, coordinated the defense while bearing the crushing knowledge that the Emperor could not come to their aid. The ancient psyker pushed himself beyond all reasonable limits, using his psychic powers to strengthen the defenders and confound the attackers, all while maintaining the countless administrative functions necessary to keep the defense organized. He knew he was burning out his own life force, that he would not survive this siege even if Terra did. But that was a price he was willing to pay. The siege ground on for weeks, then months, as both sides refused to yield. The traitors could not break through the final defenses, and the defenders could not drive the traitors back. The stalemate was broken only when Horus, growing desperate as reports arrived of loyalist reinforcements approaching the Sol system, prepared to teleport to the vengeful spirit and lead a final assault personally. But before that climactic confrontation could occur, the defenders endured one more horror, one more atrocity that would scar the survivors for the rest of their lives and echo through 10 millennia of imperial history. The Emperor's children, having grown bored with the siege and frustrated by their inability to participate meaningfully in the assault on the palace, embarked on a final orgy of destruction against Terra's remaining civilian population. They systematically hunted down every living soul in the territories they controlled, subjecting them to tortures and violations that would make demons pause in shock. Millions died in ways that defy description and should not be remembered, but can never be forgotten. The sounds that came from the Emperor's children's domains carried across Terra, audible even within the palace walls. The screams spoke of suffering so profound that it broke the minds of those who heard them, drove strong men to suicide, and sent women mad with grief. Children who survived by hiding while their parents were taken would wake screaming for years afterward, their nightmares filled with sounds they could never unhear. This systematic brutalization served no military purpose, advanced the traitors' cause not at all, and in fact detracted from it by occupying forces that could have been deployed against the palace. But the Emperor's children cared nothing for military necessity or strategic objectives. They had descended so far into depravity that only the infliction and experience of extreme sensation mattered to them, and Terra's billions of civilians provided fresh victims for their insatiable hunger. The rage this generated among the defenders was palpable. These were civilians under imperial protection, citizens of Terra who should have been safe under the Emperor's aegis. That they had died, not cleanly in war, but defiled and degraded by those who should have been their protectors, was a betrayal that struck at the very heart of what the Imperium represented. The defenders swore oaths of vengeance, promised that no Emperor's children who fell into their hands would die easily, but oaths and rage could not save those already dead or suffering. The refugees in the palace who had family members still outside the walls had to live with the knowledge that their loved ones were likely among the Emperor's children's victims, that even now they might be experiencing torments beyond imagination. The psychological damage this inflicted was profound and permanent, creating a legacy of trauma that would affect generations. When the Emperor finally confronted Horus aboard the vengeful spirit and struck down his wayward son, when the traitor forces broke and fled in disarray, the surviving defenders emerged from the palace to find a world transformed into hell. Billions were dead, more than had died in any previous conflict in human history. The landscape was a nightmare of craters and ruins, of radioactive wastelands and plague-ridden zones that would remain uninhabitable for centuries. The sky was choked with ash and toxins that would take decades to clear. The seas, already diminished by the unification wars, had boiled away entirely from the heat of billions of bodies and the fires that had consumed the surface. The survivors stumbled through the ruins in shock, unable to process the scope of the devastation. They found bodies everywhere, in every conceivable state of decay and mutilation. They found evidence of the atrocities that had been committed, signs of suffering that made them vomit or weep or simply shut down emotionally as their minds refused to accept what they were seeing. The psychological impact on the survivors was catastrophic and permanent. They had witnessed the end of their world, had seen everything they knew destroyed and everyone they loved killed. Many simply gave up, lying down among the ruins and waiting for death to claim them because they could not find a reason to continue living in a galaxy that could produce such horror. Others descended into madness, their minds broken by trauma too severe for any recovery. Still others turned to faith with a desperation born of need, finding in religion the only thing that could give meaning to suffering this profound. The distrust of space marines that would define Terran culture for the next 10,000 years was born in this moment. The people of Terra had seen the Emperor's children, had witnessed what space marines could become when they fell to chaos. They had learned that the angels of death could just as easily become the angels of damnation, that the warriors created to protect humanity could become its worst nightmare. This knowledge could not be unlearned, and it colored every interaction between Terrans and Astartes for millennia to come. The physical rebuilding of Terra took centuries, with entire regions remaining uninhabitable for generations. The population had been reduced by an estimated 80 to 90%, billions of lives snuffed out in a matter of months. The survivors carried scars, both physical and psychological, that marked them as siege veterans, gave them a haunted quality that never entirely faded. They had looked into the abyss and survived, but they had not emerged unchanged. The children born in the years immediately following the siege were exposed to radiation and toxins that caused mutation rates to spike dramatically. Many were born with deformities or genetic damage that condemned them to short, painful lives. The authorities attempted to control this through selective breeding and mandatory genetic screening, but the damage had been done and would echo through the bloodlines of Terra's population for countless generations. The institutional trauma of the siege shaped the Imperium that emerged from the Horus heresy. The paranoia, the authoritarianism, the willingness to sacrifice anything for security, all of these traits that would come to define the Imperium in the dark millennium to follow had their roots in the horrors witnessed during the siege of Terra. The Inquisition would be founded to prevent another betrayal on the scale of Horus's. The systematic suppression of knowledge would be justified as necessary to protect humanity from the corrupting influence of chaos. The grinding oppression that characterized imperial society would be explained as the price of survival in a hostile universe. But for those who had lived through it, who had seen their friends and family die in the defense of Terra, these institutional changes were abstract concerns compared to the immediate reality of their trauma. They carried the memories of the siege like open wounds that never fully healed, passed down their pain to their children through stories and nightmares, created a culture of remembrance that kept the horrors alive in collective memory. The veterans, both military and civilian, formed communities of survivors who understood what they had endured in ways that outsiders never could. They gathered on anniversaries of major battles or significant dates, sharing memories and offering mutual support. They performed rituals of remembrance for the dead, speaking names that would otherwise be forgotten, ensuring that the billions who died would not disappear entirely from history. The monuments erected to commemorate the siege were stark and brutal, reflecting the nature of the conflict they memorialized. There were no triumphant statues of heroic warriors, no celebrations of glorious victory. Instead, the monuments were walls inscribed with names, vast fields of markers representing the uncountable dead, structures designed to convey the weight of loss rather than the pride of triumph. The Siege of Terra was not simply a military campaign or a historical event. It was a trauma that defined humanity's future, that shaped the Imperium in ways both obvious and subtle, that demonstrated the true cost of survival in a universe hostile to human existence. For those who lived through it, it was the end of one world and the painful birth of another, a transition marked by suffering beyond measure and sacrifice beyond counting. In the 10,000 years since, the scars of the siege have never fully healed. The radioactive zones persist. The ruins remain as monuments to destruction. The stories are passed down through generations, growing in the telling but never quite capturing the full horror of the reality. And the people of Terra, living on a world that is now a monument to that ancient conflict, carry the legacy of the siege in their bones, in their culture, in their collective memory. This is what it was like to live on Terra during the siege. This is the price humanity paid for its survival. This is why the Imperium is what it is, why it cannot be what it should be, why hope has been traded for endurance and dreams have been replaced with the simple determination to survive one more day. The siege taught humanity a lesson written in the blood of billions. That survival requires sacrifice, that security demands vigilance, that trust is a luxury that can lead to extinction. Whether this lesson was worth the cost of learning, it is a question that 10,000 years of imperial history has failed to answer. If this deep dive into one of the darkest moments in the Warhammer 40k universe has captured your interest, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. There are countless more stories to tell from this grim, dark future where there is only war, and your support helps ensure we can continue exploring the depths of this rich and complex universe. Thank you for watching, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Terra, in the early 31st millennium, was a world of profound contrasts and crushing inequalities, a planet that bore the scars of countless wars while still clinging to fragments of its former glory. The Emperor himself had attempted to heal the damage wrought by the Age of Strife and the Unification Wars, creating artificial oceans to replace those boiled away in nuclear fire, establishing nature preserves where genetically reconstructed flora and fauna from old Earth could thrive. Within the Imperial Palace, gardens of surpassing beauty stretched across entire valleys, terraced paradises where trees from 1,000 worlds grew alongside carefully maintained descendants of Earth's original ecosystems. But these islands of beauty were tiny exceptions in an ocean of urban sprawl that had consumed nearly every habitable surface of the planet. The hive cities of Terra were not yet the totality-encompassing monoliths they would become in the 41st millennium, but they were already vast beyond comprehension. Each major hive housed hundreds of millions of souls, vertical cities that plunged deep into the earth and soared kilometers into the toxic sky. These structures were layered civilizations unto themselves, with their own cultures, dialects, and social hierarchies that varied wildly from level to level. At the apex of these hives lived the nobility and high-ranking administratum officials, their spires breaking through the smog layer to bask in actual sunlight, a luxury most Terrans experienced only in propaganda vids. These elites dwelt in apartments larger than entire hab blocks in the lower levels, decorated with art and artifacts from across the galaxy. They ate real food grown in hydroponics, gardens rather than synthesized protein, drank water that had never passed through a recycling plant, and breathed air that had been purified multiple times. Their children received educations from the finest tutors, learning languages and arts that the masses below could not even imagine. In the middle levels resided the functionaries and workers who kept the vast machinery of imperial bureaucracy functioning. These were the scribes who processed requisitions for distant worlds, the tech adepts who maintained the data systems, the merchants who facilitated trade between sectors. They lived in relative comfort by the standards of most of Terra's population, with hab units that might house only 10 or 20 people instead of the 50 or more crammed into lower-level spaces. They had access to better food, cleaner water, and the possibility of advancement if they proved themselves worthy. Their children could aspire to positions in the administratum, perhaps even rising to the lower ranks of the nobility if they possessed exceptional talent and exceptional luck. But these middle classes represented only a fraction of Terra's total population. The vast majority existed in the lower and under hives, in conditions that ranged from merely desperate to utterly hellish. Here, in levels where sunlight had never penetrated and probably never would, Billions toiled in manufactorums and processing plants, working shifts that could last 20 hours or more. They lived in hab blocks designed for perhaps 1 million occupants, but crammed with 3 or 4 million, sleeping in shifts on cots shared by multiple families. The air they breathed was thick with industrial pollutants, and the stench of unwashed bodies, recycled so many times that it barely sustained life. The water they drank had passed through countless bodies before reaching them, purified just enough to prevent immediate death, but not enough to remove the foul taste or dubious clarity. For these masses, life was a grinding struggle against poverty, overcrowding, and the constant threat of violence. They ate synthetic protein that barely qualified as food, flavored with chemical additives that mimicked taste but provided no nutrition. They worked jobs that destroyed their bodies through repetitive motion and exposure to toxins, knowing that when they could no longer perform their duties, they would be discarded like the machinery they tended. Their greatest hope was that one of their children might be selected for service in the administratum, might escape the cycle of poverty that had defined their families for generations. Even deeper than the lower hives existed the underhives, forgotten zones where the dregs of society eked out brutal existences beyond the reach of imperial law. Here, gangs ruled through violence and intimidation, controlling access to vital resources like clean water and edible food. Mutants whose deformities marked them as unfit for normal society lurked in the shadows, preying on the weak or forming their own twisted communities. These zones were labyrinths of collapsed structures and forgotten passages, dangerous even for the heavily armed Arbites who occasionally ventured down to conduct purges when the threat level grew too high. The social stratification extended beyond mere economics into matters of basic survival. A square meter of land on Terra's surface cost more than an entire estate on most hive worlds, pricing home ownership beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest. Even the concept of owning land was alien to most Terrans, who had never experienced the sensation of walking on actual soil or seeing a horizon that wasn't dominated by hab blocks and industrial towers. They were born in hives, lived their entire lives in hives, and would die in hives, never knowing what it meant to stand under an open sky or feel unprocessed wind on their faces. The cultural life of Terra was as stratified as its physical geography. The upper classes attended symphony performances in gilded concert halls, viewed art exhibitions featuring works from across the Imperium, and engaged in intellectual salons where they debated philosophy and governance. The middle classes had access to more modest entertainments, communal viewing of propaganda vids and approved historical dramas, organized sporting events that provided temporary distraction from the grind of daily life. But for the lower classes, entertainment was whatever they could create themselves: illegal gambling, unlicensed fighting pits, homemade alcohol that could blind or kill if brewed improperly, and the fleeting pleasure of physical intimacy in cramped spaces that offered no privacy. Religion, though officially suppressed under the imperial truth's doctrine that there were no gods, flourished in the shadows of the lower hives. People who had nothing else clung to faith as a source of meaning and hope. They gathered in secret to worship the emperor as a god, despite his declared atheism, or maintained ancient traditions passed down from old Earth's varied cultures. The authorities turned a blind eye to most of this, as long as it didn't threaten social stability, understanding that sometimes people needed something to believe in to make their suffering bearable. The manufactorums that employed billions of Terrans produced everything from basic tools to components for starships, their assembly lines running continuously in shifts that never ended. Workers stood at their stations for hours at a time, repeating the same motions until their muscles screamed and their minds went numb. Injuries were common and often permanent, with minimal medical care available for those who couldn't afford private physicians. The dead were replaced within hours, their positions filled by desperate souls from the waiting lists that stretched into the millions. The transit systems that connected different parts of Terra were marvels of engineering that had become nightmares. Of overcrowding. Massive underground trains moved millions of workers from residential zones to industrial areas, their cars packed so densely that passengers often couldn't move their arms. Delays or breakdowns could trap people underground for hours, sometimes leading to stampedes or crushing as panic spread through the trapped masses. The deaths that resulted from these incidents were considered acceptable losses, factored into the operational statistics as inevitable costs of moving such vast numbers of people. Criminal enterprises thrived in the gaps of imperial authority, particularly in the lower hives where enforcement was sporadic at best. Gangs controlled smuggling routes, ran protection rackets, and maintained their own brutal codes of justice. They recruited children barely old enough to walk, training them in violence and teaching them that survival meant being harder and more ruthless than everyone around them. These gang wars claimed thousands of lives every year, small-scale conflicts that the authorities largely ignored as long as they didn't spread to the middle or upper levels. Despite all this hardship, or perhaps because of it, the people of Terra possessed a certain fierce pride in their home world. This was humanity's birthplace, the cradle from which their species had spread across the stars. To be Terran meant something, carried a weight that citizens of other worlds could never fully claim. They might live in squalor, might struggle every day just to survive, but they walked the same ground that the Emperor himself had walked, breathed the same air he had breathed. That connection to the master of mankind gave them an identity that transcended their individual circumstances. The families that had lived on Terra for generations developed their own traditions and customs, passed down through oral history and preserved despite the constant pressure of daily survival. They celebrated ancient festivals whose origins had been lost to time, maintained recipes for traditional foods even when the ingredients had to be synthesized, and told stories of old Earth that grew more mythical with each retelling. These cultural touchstones provided continuity and meaning, connecting the present generation to ancestors who had lived before the age of strife, before the long night, all the way back to Terra's golden age. Education for the masses was basic and utilitarian, focused on teaching the skills needed for whatever jobs the students would likely perform. Reading and writing were taught only to the extent necessary for understanding work orders and basic communication. Mathematics was limited to the arithmetic needed for inventory and accounting. History was propaganda designed to instill loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperium, with actual facts secondary to the approved narrative. The few who showed exceptional aptitude might be selected for advanced training, but for most, education ended by their teens as they entered the workforce to contribute to the family's survival. The medical care available to most Terrans was rudimentary at best. Small injuries were treated with basic first aid, infections with whatever antibiotics could be scrounged or purchased. Serious illnesses or injuries often meant death, as advanced medical treatment was prohibitively expensive for those without connections or wealth. Life expectancy varied wildly by social class, with upper-class Terrans potentially living well into their second or even third century thanks to rejuvenate treatments, while lower-class citizens were old by 40 and dead by 60, their bodies worn out by hard labor and poor nutrition. Yet even in these dire circumstances, people found ways to create joy and meaning. Parents treasured their children, protecting them as best they could and dreaming of better futures for them. Couples fell in love and formed bonds that sustained them through hardships that would have broken them individually. Communities formed around shared experiences and mutual support, with neighbors helping neighbors because they knew that tomorrow they might be the ones needing help. This was Terra before the siege, a world of crushing inequality and daily struggles, but also of human resilience and stubborn hope. The people who lived here had never known ease or comfort, but they had endured, generation after generation, maintaining their humanity in circumstances that should have crushed it out of them. They were survivors, their ancestors having weathered the age of strife and the unification wars, and that survival instinct was bred into their bones. When word began to spread that Horus had betrayed the Emperor, that civil war had erupted across the galaxy, most Terrans understood the implications long before official proclamations confirmed their fears. They knew that eventually, inevitably, the war would come to Terra. Horus's goal had always been the throne world, and nothing would stop him from bringing his forces to humanity's doorstep. The question was not if the siege would come, but when and whether they would survive it. The preparations for Terra's defense began years before the first traitor ship entered the Sol system. But for most Terrans, the reality of coming war only hit home when those preparations began to affect their daily lives. Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, and appointed Praetorian of Terra, transformed the planet into the most heavily fortified world in human history, and that transformation required sacrifices from everyone. The first indication came when construction crews began requisitioning buildings and entire hab blocks for fortification projects. Families were given hours to gather their possessions before being relocated to make way for bunkers and defensive positions. Some resisted, refusing to leave homes that had sheltered their ancestors for generations, and were forcibly removed by Arbeitsenforcers who had no patience for sentiment when the survival of humanity was at stake. The displaced millions were crammed into already overcrowded hives, adding to the population density until conditions became almost uninhabitable. Military conscription swept through the lower and middle classes like a scythe through wheat, taking anyone physically capable of holding a last gun and teaching them the basics of military discipline. The training was abbreviated by necessity, condensed into weeks, what should have taken months or years. Raw recruits learned to field strip their weapons, to form firing lines, to follow orders without question or hesitation. They were told they were being given the honor of defending humanity's birth world, that their sacrifice would be remembered forever in the annals of imperial history. Most understood the truth beneath the propaganda. They were being trained to die, and the only question was how many enemies they could take with them. Food rationing was implemented across Terra, with civilian allocations reduced to ensure military forces would have adequate supplies for an extended siege. The protein paste that had always tasted barely edible became even more unpalatable as quality ingredients were diverted to military use. Water rations were cut, forcing families to make impossible choices about hygiene and hydration. Black markets flourished as those with resources hoarded supplies, while the desperate paid extortionate prices for extra rations that might keep their children from starving. The industrial output of Terra's manufactorums was reorganized entirely around war production. Facilities that had produced consumer goods were retooled to manufacture ammunition, weapons, and military equipment. Workers who had spent their lives making useful items for civilian use now found themselves assembling components for instruments of death. The quotas were increased, the shifts extended, and the penalties for failing to meet production targets became severe. Exhaustion-related accidents claimed thousands of lives, but the production lines never stopped, because every shell not manufactured might be the difference between victory and defeat. The void shield network around the Imperial Palace was expanded and reinforced. Its generators spread throughout the fortress in redundant arrays that could maintain coverage even if large sections were destroyed. The Aegis, as the multi-layered shield system was called, represented the most sophisticated defensive technology in the Imperium, capable in theory of stopping any orbital bombardment. Tech priests from Mars worked alongside Imperial Fists artificers to optimize the shield's efficiency, running simulations and stress tests that pushed the generators to their limits. They knew that when the bombardment came, the Aegis would be Terra's only protection against weapons capable of cracking the planet's crust. The palace itself underwent dramatic changes that transformed it from a monument to human achievement into a fortress designed to withstand the apocalypse. Beautiful sculptures and artistic friezes were stripped away and replaced with gun emplacements and firing positions. Graceful archways were reinforced with adamantium and turned into choke points where a few defenders could hold against many attackers. Gardens were paved over to create mustering grounds where entire armies could assemble. The inner gardens, the emperor's personal retreat, where he had walked among carefully cultivated flora from across the galaxy, were partially converted to emergency food production, their beauty sacrificed to military necessity. Dawn's modifications to the palace's architecture were brilliant from a defensive standpoint, but heartbreaking to those who had known the structure in its full glory. The Annapurna Gate, renowned throughout the Imperium for its artistic merit and craftsmanship, was completely dismantled on Dawn's orders. Its ornate decorations, which had taken master artisans decades to complete, were removed and stored in deep vaults on the slim hope they might someday be restored. In their place rose brutal grey donjons stippled with weapon ports, their only aesthetic the cold efficiency of killing zones and overlapping fields of fire. The Lion's Gate spaceport, one of the major entrances to the palace complex, underwent similar transformation. The magnificent sculptures of lions that had given the gate its name were replaced by weapon towers and defensive bunkers. The elegant colonnades became fortified corridors designed to channel attackers into murder holes where they could be destroyed without ever reaching the main defenses. The spaceport itself, vital for receiving reinforcements and supplies, was ringed with anti-aircraft batteries and protected by multiple layers of void shields, its importance making it both a critical asset and an obvious target. Beyond the palace walls, Dawn created defensive lines that stretched across kilometers of Terra's surface, massive earthworks and rockcrete fortifications designed to slow any ground assault and exact a terrible price from attackers. These lines incorporated the remains of older structures, cannibalized hive blocks, and industrial complexes, their materials repurposed to create walls and bunkers. The civilian populations displaced by this construction fled toward the palace, creating refugee problems that would only worsen as the siege approached. The orbital defenses around Terra were expanded to unprecedented levels. Weapons platforms filled the space between Terra and Luna, each one a fortress in its own right, capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously. Mining stations in the asteroid belt were converted to military outposts, their crews trained in combat and their facilities armed with weapons that could cripple capital ships. The goal was to create layers of defense that would attrite any attacking force before it could reach Terra itself, buying time for the final preparations even as the enemy approached. But perhaps the most controversial of Dawn's preparations was the decision to dismantle the orbital plates, the ancient space cities that had orbited Terra since before the Age of Strife. These massive structures housed billions of people, entire civilizations that had existed in orbit for so long that their inhabitants had never set foot on a planet's surface. Dawn argued that the plates represented structural weaknesses in Terra's defenses, that they could be used as weapons against the planet or as staging grounds for orbital assault. The evacuation of the plates was a logistical nightmare, with billions needing to be relocated planetside in a matter of months. The refugees from the orbital plates arrived on Terra with nothing but what they could carry, having left behind everything they had ever known. They were crammed into already overcrowded hives, their presence straining resources that were already stretched to breaking. Many died in the evacuation, crushed in stampedes or lost in the chaos of emergency transit. Those who survived found themselves in a world utterly alien to their experience, subject to gravity and weather and 1,000 other phenomena they had only read about. The culture shock was profound, and many never adjusted, spending the rest of their lives longing for the orbital homes they would never see again. The sight of the plates being dismantled, massive structures that had been fixtures of Terra's sky for millennia, breaking apart and falling in controlled de-orbits, had a profound psychological impact on the population. These were symbols of continuity and stability, and their destruction announced more clearly than any official pronouncement that the old world was ending. Children who had grown up seeing the plates as permanent features of the sky cried as they watched them fall, while their parents understood that if Dawn was willing to sacrifice these ancient structures, then he must believe the threat they faced was existential. As the months passed and more news arrived from across the galaxy, the sense of impending doom grew stronger. Reports filtered back of Horus's victories, of loyalist forces destroyed or driven back, of entire sectors falling under traitor control. The propaganda broadcasts tried to maintain public morale by emphasizing Imperial successes and minimizing defeats, but the truth leaked through in whispered conversations and black market news sheets. People who had access to astropathic communications or who worked in the administratum knew things were going badly, and that knowledge spread through the population like a virus. The psychological strain of waiting for the siege began to tell on the population. Suicides increased as people who couldn't face the coming horror took their own lives. Domestic violence spiked as stress and fear found outlets in families already living on the edge. The Arbites found themselves overwhelmed by civil disturbances, riots, and protests, and outbreaks of mass hysteria that they struggled to contain. In some cases, they resorted to brutal suppression, opening fire on crowds to restore order, adding to the death toll that was already climbing even before the first enemy ship arrived. Religious fervor intensified as people sought meaning and comfort in faith. The temples overflowed with worshippers, despite the imperial truth's official atheism. The Proto-Lectitio Divinitatis, the cult that worshipped the emperor as a god, found fertile ground in this crisis. Preachers arose in the lower hives, speaking of the emperor's divine protection and promising salvation to the faithful. Some were genuine believers who provided spiritual comfort to the desperate. Others were charlatans who exploited the crisis for personal gain, accumulating wealth and power by preying on the vulnerable. The elderly, those who had lived through the unification wars and remembered the horrors of that era, recognized the signs and understood what was coming. Many simply gave up, lying down in their beds and waiting for death to claim them before the violence could. They had seen enough suffering in their long lives and had no desire to witness another apocalypse. Their children and grandchildren, desperate to keep them alive, tried everything to maintain their will to live, but many of the old ones simply closed their eyes and let go, choosing peaceful death over the nightmare to come. Families made desperate plans for the siege. Those with resources tried to buy their way off-world, seeking passage on the few civilian vessels still departing the Sol system. But Dawn's blockade was thorough, and most found their escape routes cut off. Some resorted to bribery, offering everything they had for a chance to leave, only to be betrayed and robbed by those they thought would save them. The ships that did manage to sneak through the blockade were so overcrowded that many passengers died from suffocation or disease before reaching their destinations. Those without the means to flee made different preparations. They stockpiled food and water in hidden caches, knowing that official supplies would never be sufficient. They created bolt holes in the deep hab levels, secret rooms where they might hide if the worst came to pass. They taught their children how to find safe water sources, how to treat basic injuries, how to stay silent when danger was near. These were survival skills passed down from the age of strife, knowledge that had lain dormant for generations, but now had to be relearned. The young men and women being conscripted into the Imperial Army said goodbye to their families, knowing it might be forever. Parents pressed keepsakes into their children's hands, small tokens to remember home by, while trying to maintain brave faces that crumbled as soon as their sons and daughters turned away. Lovers promised to find each other after the siege, making vows they knew might be impossible to keep, but needing to believe in a future beyond the horror. Friends who had grown up together in the Habs volunteered to serve in the same units, preferring to face death alongside familiar faces rather than die alone among strangers. The conscripts' training was brutally abbreviated, compressed into a few weeks what should have taken months. They learned to march in formation, to fire their lasguns at targets, to follow orders without hesitation. They were taught basic battlefield first aid, how to apply pressure bandages and tourniquet bleeding wounds, though everyone understood that most combat injuries would be far beyond what field medicine could address. They were shown images and videos of the traitor forces they would face, though the instructors carefully edited out the more disturbing examples of chaos corruption, knowing that exposing raw recruits to such horrors would break their minds before the fighting even began. In the final weeks before the traitor fleet arrived, the tension on Terra reached a breaking point. People moved through their days in a fog of dread, performing their duties mechanically while their minds raced with fears of what was coming. Sleep became difficult or impossible for many, their rest disturbed by nightmares and anxiety. Children picked up on their parents' fear and became clingy and fearful themselves, asking questions that had no comforting answers. The wealthy tried to maintain their normal routines, attending social functions and continuing their lives of privilege as if nothing had changed. But even they could not entirely ignore the reality closing in around them. Their conversations, previously focused on politics and business and social maneuvering, increasingly turned to the siege and what it might mean. Some spoke bravely about the inevitable Imperial victory, but others admitted their fears in private, acknowledging that all their wealth and status might mean nothing when the killing started. In the manufacturums, productivity actually increased as workers threw themselves into their labor with desperate intensity. If they kept busy, kept their hands and minds occupied, they could avoid thinking about the future for a few more hours. The quotas were exceeded for the first time in years, not because of management pressure, but because the workers needed something to do, some way to contribute to the defense, even if it was just assembling one more shell, manufacturing one more power pack for a laser gun. The medical facilities prepared for the casualties they knew were coming, stockpiling supplies and training additional personnel in emergency procedures. They converted entire wings to triage and emergency treatment, creating capacity for the thousands or tens of thousands of wounded they expected. But even as they prepared, the medical professionals understood that their preparations would be woefully inadequate, that the scale of casualties would overwhelm any response they could mount. They would do their best, would save everyone they could, but it would never be enough. The Space Marines of the defending legions became increasingly visible as they moved through Terra, conducting inspections and establishing defensive positions. For most Terrans, who had never seen a Space Marine in person, the sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. These were giants in ornate armor, warriors who stood over 2 meters tall and moved with a grace that belied their bulk. They were the Emperor's angels of death, humanity's finest warriors, and their presence should have been reassuring. But the people of Terra had also heard rumors from the surviving refugees who had fled other worlds, stories of Space Marines who had turned traitor, who now fought for Horus and chaos. The cognitive dissonance of seeing these demigods as both protectors and potential enemies planted seeds of fear that would blossom into the permanent distrust that would characterize Terran attitudes toward Astartes for the next 10,000 years. If Space Marines could betray the Emperor, if they could become enemies of humanity, then what could truly be trusted? The final days before the traitor fleet arrived were characterized by a strange calm, a sense of unreality as people waited for the storm to break. They went about their routines, worked their shifts, cared for their families, all while feeling like they were watching themselves from a distance. The waiting was its own form of torture, the anticipation worse in some ways than the actual fighting would be, because at least when the battle began, there would be no more uncertainty, no more dread of what might come. And then, after 7 years of civil war that had torn the galaxy asunder, after months of increasingly desperate preparations, after weeks of unbearable tension, the enemy finally came. The first reports arrived from the outer system defenses, sensor readings showing a fleet so vast it seemed to fill the void itself. Thousands of ships, from massive battleships to swift raiders, all bearing the marks of Horus's rebellion. The ships themselves were wrong in ways that went beyond mere military opposition, their hulls showing signs of corruption and modification that spoke of warp taint and demonic influence. The news spread through Terra's population with terrifying speed, despite official attempts to control information. Voxcasters announced that enemy forces had been detected and that the defenses were engaging them. But the calm, measured tones of the announcers couldn't hide the magnitude of what was happening. People gathered in public squares and hab-level common areas, pressing close to vox sets and picked screens, hungry for any scrap of information about the battle being fought in the void above their heads. Those with access to long-range optical equipment or augury arrays watched the distant flashes of weapons fire as the solar war began in earnest. Each brief flash represented tremendous violence, capital ships exchanging broadsides that could level cities, torpedoes streaking through the void to detonate against shields or hull plating. Loyalist ships died trying to hold the traitor advance, their crews sacrificing themselves to buy Terra precious hours or even minutes. Every explosion was another few hundred or few thousand lives snuffed out, another ship that would never return home. The psychological impact of watching this orbital battle was devastating. People stood in the streets, faces turned to the sky, watching lights that represented death on an industrial scale. Parents tried to shield their children from the sight, but the children could sense the fear in their elders, and it infected them in turn. The young ones cried without understanding why, picking up on the terror that filled the air like a physical presence. The battles in space progressed with terrifying speed as the traitor forces smashed through Dawn's carefully prepared defensive lines. The weapons, platforms that should have held for days, were overrun in hours. The mining stations converted to military outposts sent desperate final transmissions before going silent, their crews choosing to die fighting rather than surrender. The second ring of defenses fared better, but still fell faster than the most pessimistic projections had estimated, revealing the true strength of Horus's armada. As the traitor fleet penetrated deeper into the Sol system, people on Terra could see the ships with their naked eyes, bright points moving against the stars with terrible purpose. At night, the orbital battle lit up the sky, flashes of energy weapons and missile detonations visible even through Terra's perpetual smog layer. The light show was beautiful in a horrible way, deadly fireworks that marked the deaths of thousands with each burst of illumination. The fear grew with each passing hour as the traitors came closer. Parents clutched their children and tried to find words of comfort that would make sense of the senseless. Lovers held each other and made promises they knew they might not be able to keep. The elderly sat in silence, remembering the last time they had felt this kind of existential dread, during the Unification Wars, when the future itself seemed in doubt. Military units across Terra were placed on high alert, soldiers standing to their weapons and waiting for the order to engage. The Space Marines took their positions along the palace walls, their enhanced senses detecting the approach of their traitor brothers. The Legio Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard, maintained their vigil in the inner palace, ready to give their lives to protect the master of mankind. The Sisters of Silence, those rare individuals whose presence nullified psychic powers, positioned themselves at key points, knowing their abilities might be the only defense against the warp-spawned horrors that would accompany the traitor forces. The Titan Legios prepared their god machines for war. The Princeps, who piloted these colossal engines, linking with their titans through neural interfaces. The machine spirits of these ancient weapons stirred from dormancy, eager for battle after the tedious years of peace. The Legio Ignatum's god machines, painted in red and gold, stood ready with plasma weapons charging and void shields at full strength. The crews performed final checks and rituals, anointing their machines with sacred oils and speaking prayers to the Omnissiah, the machine god, who they believed watched over all technology. In the deep chambers beneath the palace, in the webway gate that Magnus had shattered years before, the Emperor sat upon the golden throne and fought a war that few even knew existed. He held back the tide of demons that poured through the breach, using his immense psychic might to prevent Terra from being overrun from within. This secret battle had raged for years, draining his strength and preventing him from leading his forces in person. Malcador, the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor, coordinated the defense while bearing the knowledge that the master of mankind could not come to their aid, that they would have to hold without his direct intervention. The traitor fleet finally achieved orbit around Terra after weeks of fighting through the solar defenses. The surviving loyalist ships withdrew to the outer system, regrouping for potential strikes against vulnerable points in the siege lines, but unable to challenge the traitor armada's control of near Terra space. The sight of enemy vessels filling the sky, so many that they were visible as a swarm even from the surface, broke something in many Terrans. This was real, undeniable, inescapable. The enemy was here, and the only question now was how long the defenders could hold.